those kind of challenges we put to ourselves, or want to write a book, or want to find a true relationship, or start a new career, all those things are good, but you can't do it if you don't accept yourself. It's like you're putting your self-acceptance on hold until you get those things. Hello, welcome to another episode of Soul Sessions with Deborah and Rob Maldonado and Creative Mind. And before we begin our topic today, I just wanted to remind you to join us and subscribe to us. If you're watching us on YouTube, there's a little button in the corner. You can click on it to subscribe. And if you're watching us or listening to us on the podcast, Spotify, iTunes, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any episode of our podcast.
Yeah,
so
and leave us a comment.
Feel free to leave us comments, leave a review. We'd love those, love the feedback. And we're continuing our series this week on the Upanishads, our summer series. And today is the best way to have self-acceptance, to experience that. And that is such a big topic for lots of people.
Yeah, it's one of those universal questions that we all have to grapple with. Mm-hmm. Do we accept ourselves? Personal development, you can see, is a big part of that, right? We're always trying to improve ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Self-improvement. And a lot of people think self-acceptance means like, I just have to learn to love myself, self-love, which is a part of it. But we're going to go deeper with self-acceptance in a new way. So I know when I first started doing personal development back in the 80s, the big thing was low self-esteem. You have low self-esteem. And so a lot of the work I did was trying to think positive. I'm good enough. I'm strong enough. Remember that Saturday Night Live skit and people like me. So a lot of people tie that to this loving the human side of ourselves, which is important. Yeah. And we all struggle with it. Every single person, no matter how much you accomplish in life, there's always that doubt we all have, whether we admit it or not, that it's not enough yet. And so it's a natural human processing that happens with all of us. Yeah.
So let's start with, because it is about Eastern philosophy, especially the Upanishads. Let's start by seeing what they say about the self.
Mm-hmm. So what do they say?
So this is from the Katha Upanishad. It says, know the Atman to be the master of the chariot. The body is the chariot. The intellect, the charioteer. And the mind, the reins. So let's break it apart, because it's a short little verse, but it contains a lot. So the Atman, it says, know the Atman. The Atman we can interpret as what in the West is called the soul. Mm. It's the eternal, divine part of our human nature. So it says, know the Atman to be the master of the chariot. What is the chariot? It says the chariot is the body.
The vehicle, right? The vehicle that we're traveling through life in.
That's right. Mm. And then know the intellect. Now, intellect here, it's a translation from the Sanskrit, but what they're getting at is this witness, pure awareness in our mind. It's the ability, in psychology we call that meta-consciousness or meta-awareness. It's the ability of our mind to observe its own thoughts, its own feelings.
Self-reflection, almost?
Very much so.
We wouldn't be able to examine ourselves or even hear our thoughts if there wasn't another part of us that's watching the thoughts.
That's it. So it says the intellect is the charioteer.
So the driver of the chariot?
Yes. And now this is in ideal situations, right? And the mind, it says, then the mind, meaning the totality of our thoughts, experiences, learning, memory, are the reins of the charioteer, meaning, or of the chariot. We can learn through that higher intellect, through that meta-awareness, to drive our body in a meaningful way by learning how to work with the mind.
So almost like steering too,
Yes.
like in the direction, like moving toward what we want, moving toward things in our life that we want to create.
That's right. And still, let's say we ask who created the chariot and where did it come from? It says, well, it's an aspect of the Atman. Now, this is very different than our conception in the West of the soul and the body. There was, like in a lot of spiritual Western traditions, the body was seen as very negative, something to get rid of, something to castigate, self-flagellation.
It's dirty, it's terrible. It has sinful thoughts and urges, right?
Yes. But here it's saying it's a part of the soul, essentially. It's part of the Atman. It's a manifestation of the Atman. That's why in some practices they say, well, the body is the temple of the soul.
I've heard this before. When I was going to massage therapy school, I was training to be a masseuse back in my early entrepreneurial journeys, and they said the body is the part of the soul you can touch. I love that. Yeah, it's like it's not separate. It's a living your living soulful self.
Yes. So how can we make this wisdom practical for people like ourselves so we can use it in our everyday life? Because we're in sore need of a good psychology that addresses these deeper questions without necessarily having to go to the Himalayas and shave our heads or do all those radical things.
Unless we want to.
Unless we have time. And, So really that's our task. Is we're looking at this ancient wisdom and asking, what's the psychology behind this, and is it applicable to the way we live today?
And what does it have to do with self-acceptance?
Right.
And the way it's kind of a hidden double meaning with self-acceptance, because the totality of the chariot, the reins, the driver, and the Atman is the self, like the big self in Eastern philosophy. It's the totality, the wholeness of every aspect of ourselves, undivided.
Yes. So when in ordinary terms we say, let's move towards self-acceptance. The way we hear it in the West and in most industrialized countries is that we should accept our human frailties, our human flaws, and say, well, maybe that's the best we can do.
Or even say, self-acceptance means I speak kindly to myself. I have good self-talk.
Yeah.
And I take care. Self-acceptance is like, I love that I tried, and good job, and that positive reinforcement, almost like a parent to a child, as you accept the child unconditionally, that unconditional self-regard.
Right. And in that sense, if we ask, who is the self that they're referring to in self-acceptance, it's the empirical self, meaning the reactive ego self, the sense of I in the mind, very Freudian, Jungian, right? That's the idea of there's this sense of I that's arising in my mind in relationship to the world. That if there is this world that I am observing, there must be an I observing that world, and therefore it gives rise to that I, that ego.
And if the observer is in a body, we think that the body is separate from everything else, and we're identifying our body. Our eyes are seeing something. It's my eyes, my ears, my sense of touch, my memory even of, and the culmination of all our conditioned responses and reactions to life becomes this ego self.
Yeah. So in the formulation of the Upanishads here, it would say, I, the chariot, am accepting myself as the chariot, and that there are these senses, the horses that are driving me, and I'm experiencing external objects in the world.
Sort of like a self-driving car.
Kind of, yeah.
Where you're just not you're not taking the reins at all of your life. You're basically reacting and taking in sense information, but you're reacting and almost on autopilot.
Right. So it's very different. The meaning is very different. This kind of idea of self-acceptance, in the typical way that we use it, to the spiritual psychology of the Upanishads. There is an aspect of it in the sense that we want to be kind towards our own mind. So in meditative practices, often the approach is, let's take a gentle approach. Let's not try to control the mind and the I, or the sense of the ego, and force it to do the will of the higher self, but simply approach it with an openness, with a kindness.
Non-judgment.
Yeah, non-judgment, non-attachment. So in that sense, that's a better way to conceptualize it, that when we are talking about the small I, the conceptual I, the reactive I.
The little me.
Yeah, the limited I, the ego. That we can say, yeah, we should accept ourselves in that regard. Self-acceptance, meaning accepting our ego self as part of what we have to work with.
Well, didn't Jung say something about that you can't change anything until you accept it? And
That's
so
right.
what we tend to do in personal growth, and I know I've been through this and I see many of my clients, they want to fix themselves and they feel this like they don't accept themselves and they're judging themselves and judging their results and judging that they're doing it wrong, and that kind of harshness doesn't really lead to change. It doesn't really, you can't really have acceptance while you're beating yourself up. And if we beat ourselves up for making mistakes, when we try to do better, we beat ourselves up for not doing better. And it's just really this like a gerbil wheel of just self criticism. And so the opposite would be self-acceptance, is understanding that most of what we choose is not our conscious choice. We're on autopilot. So understanding that first and accepting the nature of our mind is going to be reactive. It's going to be led by the senses. It's going to repress our desires and go to something familiar versus something challenging. And that, I think, is more the self-acceptance, not that I'm going to accept myself when I think positive, when I do the right thing, when I'm motivated. It's like conditionally to ourselves of like almost like disciplining ourselves to act and think correctly, and then we get a prize.
Yes, and there's great wisdom in that approach, because that willfulness to fix, to make better, to control is itself an ego function. So that when we approach our own mind, our personal development, with that sense of I need to fix, I need to be better, I need to get this under control, that itself is an ego function.
So it's like that sense of I need, the word that I want to pill out is control.
Yeah.
That we're trying to control our life. We're using these spiritual principles to control an outcome in our life. And that is the root of attachment and ego attachment.
That's right. So we're reinforcing the ego by taking that approach to letting go of the ego.
Yes.
To working with the mind.
Like, I'm not spiritual enough. I used to think that if I did that wrong, I must not be spiritual enough. I have so much more to grow, instead of just saying, okay, this is the nature of my mind. It's accepting that this is the nature. We all have this nature to react.
Yeah, so the work actually gets easier when we start to understand this more subtle approach to working with the mind. That it's saying there's nothing wrong with the idea of trying to improve yourself and trying to make your personality better and your ego a better ego, I guess.
Or even just attain goals, like have a goal and want to achieve it.
Improve your health and your appearance.
Run a faster minute in your marathon. Those kind of challenges we put to ourselves, or want to write a book, or want to find a true relationship, or start a new career. All those things are good, but you can't do it if you don't accept yourself. It's like you're putting your self-acceptance on hold until you get those things.
Right, so that the approach is one of openness, one of non-judgment. Mm-hmm. So that we're not approaching ourselves with that intent to fix and intent to control, but the intention is simply to become more aware, to give it space, to give it plenty of room to breathe. So we're letting our thoughts and our emotions be themselves, instead of making them right or wrong, because often we're taught, try to get rid of toxic emotions and thoughts and focus on the good ones.
Or toxic people in our life, like cushion us our way and avoid certain situations, and then feel that you're always on edge.
That's right, because that plays back into that dualistic self in the universe. I am separate from the world. It is out there, and I am in here. Mm-hmm. And that's a false assumption. It simply arises from our perceptual system, the way our senses are set up. They're very good at helping us survive in the natural world, but they're not really helping us understand the true nature of reality. So a lot of these deeper psychologies, like the psychology we find in the Upanishads, is simply pointing at how can we get back to understanding the true nature of our mind so that we can perceive reality in a true way.
And I guess the question we're trying to answer for ourselves is, who am I? Am I the ego, or am I the self, the bigger self?
That's
and
right.
So what is the bigger self in non-dualism?
Right. So from the Upanishads, we see that the self, the Atman, and Atman, we can think of it, and the way it's explained in the Upanishads, the psychology of it, it's saying who you are as an individual embodiment. At the core of that is the Atman. And that Atman is identical to the universal awareness, to Brahman. So what it's saying is simply that at the core of your being, at your awareness, is the self, the universal self, the true self.
So the universe within, basically, that we are at the core of who we are is connected to everything. And we are everything.
That's it. It hides in plain sight because of that tendency to misperceive the objects in the world, in the universe. We assume that because I'm perceiving an object, that they're separate from me.
It's like physically apart from you. Or
yes.
A person.
That's right.
They're another person. They have nothing to do with me. And it's random that they are acting a certain way toward me.
Yeah, and that's dualism, essentially. The dualism is born from our perceptual system from the get-go, and therefore most of us just assume that that's reality. But the Upanishads, and now this is interesting, the Upanishads say that is an apparent reality. It's an appearance. This is the question. Is there evidence in science now that supports that idea? And yes, there is. Perceptual science, even quantum mechanics now is kind of coming around to the idea that the right understanding is that things are appearing in a field of consciousness, in awareness, and both the observer and the object are identical. In other words, they're both appearing in that field of consciousness.
So the object doesn't appear separate from an observer. It can't appear. The observer has to be there to have an object be there.
Yes, and that both the observer and the object are made out of the same substance, which is awareness, which is a very different reality than our perceptual dualistic sense of I am in my head observing some external objective reality that has nothing to do with me.
So it's that oneness, that idea of oneness,
Yes,
that
that's where it comes from.
interconnectedness, that even though it feels separate, it's all part of the same system. Like we are one with everything. It just appears separate.
Yeah, so if we read then self-acceptance as acceptance of that reality, of that oneness, of that non-dualism, as the way it's expressed now as a non-dualism, or as a non-dualistic universe, that makes more sense, right, at the higher level, that we are moving towards accepting and understanding that that is the true nature of our mind, of our experience in life.
So self-acceptance would be accepting, not that, oh, I like my bad qualities and I'm okay with it, but more like accepting our divine nature. That our true divine nature is this vast, powerful, universal self, and accepting that is who we are. And then when we accept that as who we are, it's hard for us to put ourselves down. You know, it's hard for us to look at our little human self and say, oh, you're a terrible person, or you screwed that up and you're never going to make it. Because when you accept your spiritual divine nature, you naturally have confidence. You naturally have feel powerful. You naturally feel at peace with yourself and with your the whole system, the little ego, the individual soul, and then this connectivity that we like. I remember one time you said to me, we were talking about this, and I said, yeah, it's kind of weird, like everyone's looking for the magic, you know, in the spirituality, like I'm gonna have this magical spiritual moment. And you said, just being alive, we're like in this body, conscious of ourselves, is a miracle in itself. We're all looking for this like crazy, out of body experiences, but just being in the body and having a conscious experience of life. And even those of you listening that are thinking, oh, wait, I'm conscious of myself while I'm listening. This is a miracle that we can actually have this experience. And so to see ourselves as a miracle is kind of mind-blowing, isn't it?
It is, and if you think of all the implications, right, that we're searching for this experience outside of ourselves, in plants, in drugs, in sensory experiences, instead of understanding that we are that already. There's nothing else we can be. Essentially, if you're aware, you are the self. That is the self. The objects that are appearing in your awareness are the self as well. So there's nothing to attain, nothing to run from, nothing to fear. But we understand it's a process, right, of purifying our mind from the past conditioning of duality.
And so that would be learning to not let the horses run wild and drag your life around, which is how we all start out, just kind of reacting. And there's no direction. It feels as though life is carrying us versus we're directing our life, our destiny. We feel everything's predestined. We don't have a choice. But when we start to bring in that intellect and that witness to hold the mind, to hold the reins, and direct the body and the chariot and the senses, we start to be able to reclaim our power. And we can only do that if we realize there's something besides this ego. Because if we only think we're the ego, it would be hard for us to think, well, I don't have a choice. I don't have this other aspect of myself, this deeper aspect of myself. I'm just this body, and one day it'll die, and I better get the most out of my life that I can.
Yeah, it's terrifying. To believe you are only the body is an existential kind of dead end, because what would be the meaning of it? That it would be meaningless, essentially, because you would simply lose everything you think you possess, and then lose your body as well. So why would you do anything at all?
And don't you think it's also, you think about the risks that we take in life? Like, should I leave my corporate job and start my own business? Should I open my heart to love again? Should I try this new thing that I don't know if I can do, like a new craft or a new skill that I want to try? And if we see ourselves from that greater self, these little tiny ego problems or these ego challenges seem so small. Yeah. And we become braver, and we become less attached to the outcome, but more, it becomes playful to be in life. Like, oh, let me try this, and let me try this on, let me have this experience. And we're less fearful, I think, because only the ego can feel that fear. Only the ego feels that threat to lose the body or lose social survival, where the self is, if you're connected to everything, then there's nowhere to fall.
Yeah. Yes. And so often the question of what's real and what's unreal comes up when looking at Eastern philosophy, because they're presenting kind of this bigger picture and saying, yeah, of course you are this small self, and the body is part of the higher self as well, but the pure awareness in you is the universal God or divine-like element in human nature, and from the Western perspective, that's a kind of a weird statement to make, because we're used to thinking of material as reality, and everything else that
it's like spiritual, right?
Yeah.
It's not real, or
that it's not real, that it only exists as imagination or thought. But there is a science to the Upanishads, and that you can apply this science yourself, because it's not verifiable in the sense that the scientific method is verifiable, that I can show another person, for example, my awareness.
Can you?
I can't. In other words, I can
Let me
never
see your awareness, Rob.
Yeah, because it is not an object, essentially. That's the difficulty. Whereas Western science is always looking at objects. Let's measure the object. Let's measure the current, the intensity of electricity, or the weight of an atom, or something like that. So there's nothing wrong with that. But there's another way to verify things, and that is that if I experience something, that if I say in meditation, if I meditate a certain way, I can reach a certain state of mind. I can certainly teach you that, and you can learn it and experience it for yourself, or not, right? And say, yeah, that's verified or not. So that's an empirical method right there. In other words, we can teach internal states of mind and internal experiences to each other, and then verify them for ourselves. That's an empirical scientific method right there. So you can try these things out. You can ask yourself, and this is a simple thought experiment.
Ooh, I like thought experiments.
Yeah, so if you look at objects, any object, so let's take that lamp right there that's in the corner. Okay. And you can choose any object that you see in the room that you're in right now. And ask, do I ever observe that object without awareness being present? It's a simple question, and it's verifiable. You can test it. Right?
I'm aware that I'm seeing that lamp.
Yes. Now, does that lamp ever appear to you in your mind without awareness?
No, or I don't know, because if I wasn't aware, I wouldn't know it was there.
Yes. In other words, awareness and the object are never appear separate from each other, which by pure logic, and often science uses this kind of logic. By pure logic, it means it points to the fact that they're one.
Mm-hmm.
They're one thing that I'm looking at, although it may appear as separate.
Mm-hmm.
That my awareness is separate from the object, and that the object is separate from my awareness. But there is no evidence of that. We've never seen it, and we never see it. Therefore, the conclusion must be that both the object and the awareness that I'm using to perceive it are one and the same. Right? That's a scientific approach.
The question is, if there is an awareness, does the object exist at all?
Yes. If there is no awareness, and again, some of the more advanced quantum mechanics is pointing to this observer reality or appearance of reality.
So everything appears in the substance of consciousness as pure possibility, and then when we observe it, it collapses into what we think we're looking at. And so we look at the light and we know it's a light, and it becomes a light because we're observing it, and it almost kind of not materializes before it at the same time. So it's kind of interesting to know that, I mean, we're really getting into what self-acceptance is, that we are one with everything, that we're not seeing a separate world from ourselves. So here's another thought experiment. Think about someone you admire who has all the things you'd want. Like if you think of someone famous or someone you know, it says they have all the results. I wish I could be that, like that person. Can you accept that that is a part of you, that you are seeing your own potential when you see that person? Like you and that person are made of the same stuff. They're just expressing it differently, or you're not accepting that that's who you can become. It appears that those other people have what I have, but not me. What do you think of that experiment?
Yeah, that's a good one too, because anything you can point to and you can observe, and you can even something in the imagination, you can ask, does it exist outside of awareness? And you'll find that it doesn't, and which goes then back to this point that your little awareness, though, that you think is a small little awareness separate that's coming from your brain, is not that at all. That's the Atman. That's the pure awareness of the universe expressed in your individual self at the core of you.
It's the self-experiencing itself through you.
That's the self, yes. Yeah. But by extension, that everything you observe, including those far-off distant galaxies that we just saw through the new telescope, the James Webb telescope, the furthest galaxies way out in the edge of the universe, that those objects are part of you, your awareness, because you're aware of them. In other words, any object that you're aware of is part of the self and is identical to the self.
So if you feel low self-esteem or you're not enough, do that experiment. Think about those pictures from that telescope, the Webb telescope, this beautiful, like billions of galaxies. And if you can say that I'm looking at my true self, like this is who I am, this amazing, universal, brilliant, unlimited self, then how could you not love that? How could you not think that it's enough? There's more, that you're more than enough. It's just that we've been conditioned by the ego and the senses to base who we are on our body and our past experience. And we think we're defined by our degrees, mostly what other people say, how people treat us, how many friends we have, what kind of relationships we have, how much money we have, what our credit score is, what we've accomplished in our life. All those things, we think that's who we are. But we're so much more than that. And so we're trying to improve this little ego and make it better so we can love ourselves, when actually we're so much more than this little body.
Yeah, a lot of it
has... It's like the shortcut to self-love, I guess.
Yeah, a lot of it has to do with what we pay attention to. Mm-hmm. So we know in psychology about focus and attention. Mm. What we do typically as human beings is we narrow our attention to personal things, And then those things, those personal problems, for example, if I focus on a personal problem, it seems to fill my whole mind. And the whole world is filled with that problem for me because I'm focusing and I'm paying attention to the problem in this particular way.
So if you think about money problems, everything you see is, and a reminder, you get an email, you hear about a bill, or you get something in the mail, or you hear someone talking about money, or you see someone on Instagram dancing on the beach and you're saying, well, how come she has that, but I don't? Everything is going to fill your mind. Love too, I see a lot of single people, everything is about, how come I don't have that person in my life yet? And it's constant, I got a wedding invitation, and it'll feel like this, your whole world. And then if I just get that result, then the mind will quiet. Then everything can relax. Then I could, move on to the next thing. It's like your life is on hold. And so that awareness is almost like a flashlight onto the problem, and then that's all you see. Like
very much
magnifying?
like the camera aperture where we narrow it down, that focus to just a small little piece, and we focus on our human problems. Whereas if we open it up, right, if we expand it as much as possible, and we can do this, you can practice this opening up of expanding your awareness to where it includes. It's infinite, and you'll know that it has no edges. Your consciousness, it doesn't have a limiting point. It will go on as far as you let it go. You can open up that aperture of awareness and start to see things in their true perspective.
Instead of that tight white knuckle life that we tend to want to live in.
Yes. So we see a lot of meditative practices are working with that focus of the mind. Instead of just letting it do its thing and focusing on the problem at hand, the practice is opening it up, letting the mind expand into its true nature, which is infinite again. And so it just starts to open up and to relax and feel more expansive.
So it's not that you ignore problems, but when you're focusing on a problem, you're also having a lot more space around it versus micro heaviness of that problem. You just it's almost like expanding, opening it up and letting it move. That's the way they actually train horses. They start off right with that big wide space, and they kind of move them in slower. That's how we've been conditioned. And then if we want that, be able to roam more, we kind of keep moving the edges out of what's possible for us. And that's what we want to do now. The beginning of life is like collapsing into conditioned response for survival. And the second half of life is us becoming aware of our true nature and our potential that we have, and expanding that field outward. And when we think of a little tiny problem, and we're so much bigger than that, it's such an amazing experience. Sometimes I do this meditation where I have the client think of that problem they have and then float up in their house, like above their house, and then float up and see above their city and just see that little tiny them having this little problem, and keep going out and to the world and then out to outer space and looking at that tiny little pinprick, a little human having that problem, and you're this universal self. So that's another way to kind of expand. You're giving a lot of room. You're not ignoring the problem, but you're seeing there's a lot more to me than just this little thing. And that's the way we really solve it, not by worrying about it, obsessing over it, and again, white knuckling ourselves through life. Like you were saying before, trying to control it. If anyone's ever rode a chariot before, if you hold the reins too tight with the horse, it's not the best way to steer. You have to have that kind of not too tight, not too loose to work with them. Have you driven a chariot before, or rode a horse?
I've been on a horse. Yeah.
And it's the same thing, right? If you are too tense, the horse picks it up. It's like that kind of intuitive, like loose, but not too tight, not too loose, guiding and being open and not forcing something to happen.
Yeah. So keep in mind, all these are possibilities within our human experience. All the way from focusing our ego mind on our small human problems and having them become huge, and just fill our whole mind, all the way to this freedom that exists within our minds to be able to identify with the higher self in us. And that's the human experience, that we have this huge range, but most of us tend to stay because of conditioning, because society doesn't acknowledge these deeper aspects of ourselves. We tend to stay within our small human problem life.
And it for some of you, this may be hard, maybe the first time you've heard it, or hard concept to grasp. It does take a while, so don't feel overwhelmed by it, but just understand that there's more to you than meets the eye. and every situation, there's more to any result that meets the eye. There's so much more behind the curtains that our egos covering over. And so just to be open to whatever shows up in our life, not to have a harsh judgment on it, on ourselves or the event or the people that come into our life that cause conflicts, to have more openness, and then trusting that there's this something bigger within us that we're connected to. And I think that helps us really deal with any problem that arises in life if we realize our true nature.
Yes, and the aim is to take the reins of the mind so that we can direct our life. The way our bodies exist in this world, we can start to direct it from the inside instead of letting the external circumstances condition us. We become the drivers from the inside. The higher self in us is able then to use our life in a creative way,
to direct our own destiny. So great topic. Next week, we have another fantastic episode wrapping up our series. And it is the question of, can the soul be wounded? Talking about continuing this conversation of the soul and what happens to the soul and what doesn't happen to it. So we'll see you next week. Again, don't forget to subscribe if you're watching us on YouTube. Click the button below, or if you're listening to us on Spotify, iTunes, or any podcast service, please be sure to subscribe. Leave a comment, review. We'd love to hear them. And we'll see you next week in another Soul Sessions.